Dr. Von Gernert, welcome back. Before lunch, we finished chapter 5 and we're moving to chapter 6. When you previewed your chapters to us at the beginning of your testimony, you mentioned that this was called unfinished business. And beginning on slide 97, I think you provide a bit of a sum up of what you've already discussed. Maybe you could take us through in brief anything that you wish to highlight.
So as we discussed, in 1875, there was a decision to augment the annuities, and that decision was based on the understanding that the maximum amount that the Anishinaabe were entitled to was one that was sufficient to cover the $4 per capita. And it was also decided at that time to pay this, the difference between what they were already being paid and the augmentation to $4 from an annual grant drawn from Canada's CRF. So at that point, there wasn't any need to keep track of future proceeds because all of the amounts that were understood to be due under the treaty were already being funded and paid for through monies other than proceeds. So now when we went through my report, I've indicated that there were a number of different scenarios that could be posited and were posited for how the Crown's obligation to pay annuities could be met. So if, for example, a court had decided that the augmentation was to be derived from revenues paid from the lands, this also didn't necessarily mean that that you continue to keep track of proceeds in the future, because if you capitalize the amount, then all you needed was a capitalization, and that would be used the interest of that would be used into perpetuity to fund what was understood to be the maximum due under the treaties. So as you noticed with the party evidence and its interpretation by Mowat, all of this was, the decision to augment in 1874 and 1875 was based on pretty sketchy data, but they decided to do it anyway. If they had done it through a capital sum, the way that Sprague and Boron had anticipated, it would have generated sufficient interest from that day on. But of course, what actually happened was they did it on a yearly basis, again, funded by the CRF without any recourse to any further income from the lands.
There's a presumption, though, that had they capitalized the income in 1870 or 1875, that it would not cover continued increased populations. You just can't presume that.
No, I mean, and this is, there's a bit of a disconnect, I suppose, between the Sprague approach and the Laird approach, right? Because if the intention had been to capitalize, then you run into the problem of, well, now you've got a set amount that's based on a certain population number, and it's you know,
Right, I'm just going back to your evidence. Had they
Yes.
done it, then they would have had sufficient interest from then on, but that's not the case.
well, it's not the case if it's anything but the time of treaty population or
Right.
a particular set population that doesn't change over time, which is
Got it.
Sprague's original idea, right?
And when you say that there was, after the decision to augment the annuities, there was, as you say in the bullet point, there was no reason to keep track of future proceeds from the lands for treaty purposes. Is that because it was assumed that now that it was augmented, it would stay augmented?
Yes. And as I said earlier, I mean, it doesn't matter how you play the numbers here, because even Sprague's Sprague understood that the augmentation, or what I should say, Sprague understood that there were sufficient funds probably for an augmentation, no matter what the population, right? So even in the event, remember we compared the numbers between what I mean, the population numbers were such that by 1875, if you capitalized it at that point in time, there'd be enough in there to cover population increases as well, right? Unless they balloon to, you know.
Where do you get that from?
Well, I
Because
mean, you just look at the numbers, right?
But Sprague chose to go down in numbers. He went to time of treaty population. So I'm
That's right.
just wondering where this comes from, that you conclude that he understood there would be sufficient funds no matter what the population.
Well, you know, I mean, all of the estimates that were coming in, like Party's estimate, for example, was more than enough to cover a capitalization, even in the event that the population increased, right? So,
Well, I
yeah,
don't know what you're meaning. If there'd been a population explosion?
well, yeah,
Are you saying without limit?
no, not without
Okay.
limit. No, obviously not. But in a, you know, within a reasonable parameter, right?
And that's assuming you knew what the population was, that you could calculate who the annuitants were.
Yes.
So,
But there is a disconnect, and I keep saying that, between sort of Laird's approach and Sprague's approach. It's
but Laird's is ultimately the one that's followed by
yes,
Canada.
ultimately Laird's is the one that's followed, but then of course at the end of this whole story, it was capitalized after all.
Quite a few years later.
Yes.
So then, is there anything else on 97 that you've not discussed already, or are we on 98 now?
98.
Slide 98?
So a capitalized fund had been recommended by Sprague, as I said, and also by Boron. And this, is consistent with, what Robinson, what his instructions had been, which were also based on a capitalized system. You may recall that his instructions had been to consider that he had a certain amount of money, which if capitalized would provide for a down payment and an annuity. And I quoted him earlier when he was said that he avoided the type of arrangement that required accounting to them for future sales, and that would have entailed much trouble to the government. Once you have set a a fixed pre-augmented annuity and an augmented annuity up to the $4 cap, then the proceeds of the lands are no longer an issue, because you now are funding what was then believed to be the maximum amount that the Anishinaabe were entitled to. So this, again, we have to think of this in terms of what Crown actors understood back then, and they understood this to be an annuity fund system, although it was a unique one. The main difference being that the Anishinaabe would only receive the maximum amount if a certain condition was met. And that had never been a condition in any previous treaty. But other than that, they looked at this basically in the same way. And they believed that the maximum, once the maximum amount was paid, there really was no other obligation to account for future sales. The future sales being only relevant to assess whether or not the augmentation clause had reached its threshold.
And then you start to talk about the question of arrears. The last couple bullet points on 98. Can you take
Yeah,
us through
so Dawson, Boron, and Blake, all three of them. So you've got the Dawson, who was the the guy who's pressing for this all along. You have Boron, who has joined him in this quest, and who is now an MP, and you have Blake, who is the Minister of Justice. All three of them intimated or stated that the condition had already been met and might already have been met at some earlier juncture. So now there was, there's no longer any talk about the augmentation into the future. Nobody ever talked about anything else now. The only thing that's still outstanding are the arrears. In what years prior to 1875 might there have been arrears payable based on proceeds, gains and proceeds exceeding costs?
And what was done about that hunch or suspicion?
Well, this could only be resolved with a more fine-grained analysis of costs and proceeds that only Ontario could provide. And so Canada repeatedly requested that Ontario furnish these particulars on proceeds. And this goes on for several years.
Can you take us through that then?
So Ontario received the correspondence, or sometimes actually it literally got lost in the shuffle, because in some cases correspondence was not actually received. But Ontario, once it did receive correspondence, repeatedly requested from Canada that they needed a definition of the RHT boundary so it could fulfill the request. Ontario had always been prepared to provide the necessary information on proceeds, but what held things up primarily was a lack of definition of the subject lands. And there was no Ontario official who would hazard a guess on the amount of proceeds in the absence of a definition of the territory. So a correspondence relating to that goes back and forth. I mean, there's a stack of it. It goes on, and so Canada asks, well, do you have the data? Ontario says, well, no, we don't, and here's why. Please kindly provide us with the definition of the territories. And this went back and forth. And meanwhile, of course, the Anishinaabe were receiving their $4 annuities. And so at that moment, we're not pressing the case. but in time, they would also come to understand the importance of pressing for the arrears. And so in February of 1877, Boron again stood in the House of Commons and inquired about any progress on this arrears issue. He didn't receive a satisfactory reply, so he rose again in April with a formal application to have all of the correspondence relating to this made public and subject to review. And at that point, the Minister of the Interior, David Mills, he stood up in the House of Commons and he warned that the calculation was of the annuities was a, quote, a very intricate and difficult matter, and that it would require very considerable care and attention to arrive at a proper result. And here he's referring to not the annuities in general, but rather the calculation of the arrears from the possibility of arrears, if any, prior to 1875.
Okay. And then that brings us to slide 100.
Yes, so now,
We see John Langton making an appearance again. Can you tell us about this?
yes, so Langton, of course, is still dealing with these lingering complexities resulting from Confederation. And so in September of 1877, he reminds the Deputy Minister of the Interior, who is Edmund Meredith, and he asks for information. And specifically what he wanted was information on the net proceeds of the lands until such time as the annual receipts exceeded the amount of $4 per head. So what he was thinking here is that, okay, so $4 per head is the maximum. What are the proceeds from the lands between, you know, the time of treaty and 1877, I suppose. And at what point during that period did those proceeds exceed the amount of that, if you translate it into per capita amounts, would exceed $4 per head? So he had the same understanding in mind that the maximum amount is enough to provide for $4 per person. And
And you say here he asked also for the number of entitled annuitants.
yes,
And why?
because
why
that's because the population variable is obviously the one that people had in mind in calculating these. Because it's a per capita amount, you need to know the population in order to make the calculation, right? And then he also wanted to know the sums that had actually been paid or were payable in 1875 to 6 and 1876 to 7. So some of this information, I mean, you can see why this is being elicited, because he's trying to determine, you know, how much to calculate when it comes time to the liability question. You know, what cost the provinces should cover versus the Dominion as a consequence of Confederation. And so the following day, immediately, Meredith provided him with at least some of the requested information.
And is this table set out, some of that?
Yes, so this is information that, this is only the portion of the Langdon request that is responsive to questions that Indian Affairs had records for. Indian Affairs obviously did not have the records for the proceeds for Crown lands, but they did have the record of the number paid and the total payment for the augmented portion of the annuity during the periods that Langdon had requested. And so this is Meredith's table of it's his answer in the form of a table.
And excuse me, is Meredith Dominion or provincial?
No, he's
Official.
he's the Dominion official.
Thank you.
He's in charge of ultimately he's at the head of Indian affairs.
So
And
this is an internal request.
yes, this would be a request from the auditor, which is a different department, to Indian affairs.
The Canada's auditor to Canada's Department of Indian
Yes.
Affairs. And so you provide, and to be clear, this is a table that you've prepared, Dr. Von Gernert, based on Meredith's numbers. Is that, do I understand that right?
Yes, well, Meredith himself created a little table like this, which is, I've just converted it into a table myself that renders it with greater clarity.
So these show us numbers about what?
Yeah, so these are just the raw numbers of individuals who were paid during the years 1875 to 77. The total payment for just for the augmented portion of the annuity.
And this augmented portion of the annuity, does this correspond with what you've told us was voted upon? Or is that something different entirely? Have I misunderstood?
No, so what you see here, you notice that the totals in the right-hand column.
Total payment for augmented portion of annuity?
Yes, so you'll notice, I mean, Langdon, the reason why he wanted this is because he didn't want to rely on what he did have is, of course, the 11,000 figure.
Mhm.
But he didn't want to rely on that. He wanted to rely on the actual payments made because he knew that the 11,000 figure was an approximation that was simply voted on and provided. And so as it turns out, as you can see, for 1875 to 76, it was actually, the actual payments were actually under 11,000, whereas in the following year, they're a little over 11,000.
Do we know what calculation he used to come up with what portion of the payment was the augmented portion?
No, these are the augmented portions. This is only the augmented portion. Right, this is the total amount of augmented portion of the annuities. There's nothing in here that's pre-augmented.
I'm not sure I'm being clear. Is this a post augmentation annuity?
Yes.
But it's 100% of the annuity. Whatever someone gets in their hands is $4.
Yes.
It's not the original pre-augmented annuity plus some figure to bring it up to $4.
No.
So it's not, I don't want to call it perhaps it just confuses me, the augmented portion of the annuity. It's the augmented annuity.
Or is it the difference maybe
Yeah.
between what they were receiving and the additional required to augment that you took us through?
Portion suggests the difference.
Okay, so this table and the request and Meredith's response had nothing to do with the pre-augmented annuity, right? It had
Maybe we
only-
can just
it had-
take
it had-
2,500 and multiply it by 4. You won't get 7888.
I'm not
No,
sure
but
what,
maybe this exposes the complexities we earlier heard that you have to figure out what they were getting in each year. Math is not my strong suit. That's why I'm now confused as well.
This is an easy one. 2,500 times 4
No, I
is,
appreciate that. I do get that.
okay.
well, these are the figures. I mean, I'm not making these up. These are the figures that.
Now, the
Meredith
question
said.
is this your column 3?
Yes,
Is that your wording?
no, this is Meredith's calculation.
But is the column heading Meredith? is I think what you're,
Right,
is asking.
we'd have to look back on, let's see, page 3.
So,
You're looking for page 309 of your report?
Yes,
and footnote 627.
This may be of no moment. It was just, it confused me.
yeah, I mean, I took the numbers, I'm not sure if the, I mean, I suspect that the title of the table or the heading of the table are my words. So you now have an annuity under the annuity funds, which are a total of the interest that you're getting from the capitalized amount of $40,000, right? Plus you are getting your portion of the 11,000 that is now also being added for the augmented,
I don't want to,
right?
I don't want to get confused. Your evidence was with respect to a request for what had actually been paid.
Yes,
So I don't need to know about 11,000 or any of those. Those are capitalized amounts. What was actually paid, one might have thought from this chart, 2,500 people. One might have thought if this was the full annuity paid, that that number would be 10,000. Because you have a number paid, which I would presume means number actually paid.
yes,
And the total payment, because it's not 10,000, I wonder, what is it? Is it,
The additional money.
that's right, is it the extra money over the dollar? Let's say they were getting $1.70.
yes,
Is it the extra that takes them to $4?
yes.
And what, so there you have it.
By somebody better than that.
So I presume the purpose of making that calculation was to figure out what came out of the 11,000 capitalized amount.
Well, 11,000, I don't believe is
Oh.
capitalized. Let's.
Oh,
make
no,
sure
no,
that that's
sorry, that's right,
accurate.
that's right, my mistake. So what comes out of some other source and what came out of the original capitalized amount? What needs to come out on an annual basis out of the
The votes.
consolidated revenue fund that hadn't been capitalized earlier in 18,
Through the annual votes that Dr. Von Gern had talked about.
right?
Do you want to comment on that then, Doctor?
Well, I mean, I indicated earlier that this is a messy affair. It's very complicated. And all I'm doing in this table is reiterating what Meredith's response was to Langdon. And Langdon's reason for asking for this is because he didn't want to rely on the 11,000 figure. He wanted something more specific. Because if you're going to calculate the actual liabilities that Ontario or Quebec or the Dominion might have at the end of the day, you want to base it on real numbers. You don't want to base it on the 11,000 that was just done for convenience to cover, the contingency.
I don't want to keep flogging this, but I'll just ask Ms. Barclay's question one more time. Did you create table 9?
Yes, I created table 9 based on Meredith's actual figures. If you
A
want
memo, but a memo, a text memo,
yes,
and you turned it into a chart.
yes.
Got it. Thank you.
But the memo itself had these numbers.
Yes.
And I noticed that, but it hasn't been reproduced on the slides, but is on page 309 of your report. You
Yes,
describe it as table 9. You can pull that up. Actual amounts of annuity augmentations paid in 1875 to 1877. According to Department of the Interior Department of the Interior Indian Branch memo.
yes. So that's obviously my title for this table.
Okay.
So as you look at my footnote, it says it's based on a memorandum by, is it 627? Yeah, so it's Lawrence Van Cougnet, of course, is the Deputy Superintendent General. And he he's the one that's advising Meredith of the amounts, because he's the civil servant. Meredith is the elected official who has to officially respond to Langdon.
Okay. Unless Eleanor has another question about that, should we move on to 102? You mentioned here about how Meredith was perhaps not able to help Langton. Do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, so of course, there was one request from Langton that Meredith did not have the answer to, and that was the part about the proceeds. And so he immediately wrote Thomas Johnson, who is Ontario's Assistant Commissioner of Crown Lands. So he is the top civil servant in dealing with the Crown Lands. And Meredith asks Johnson in a very peculiar language, more awkward, I guess, than anything else. Quote, I have the honor to request that you will have the goodness to furnish this department at your earliest convenience with a statement showing the net proceeds annually realized from the land ceded by the Indians of Lake Huron under the Treaty of the 9th of September, 1850, also from the land ceded by the Indians of Lake Superior under the Treaty of 7th September, 1850. The statement should embrace the period between the year the treaties were made and the date when the net annual receipts exceeded the amount of $4 per head of the Indians entitled to receive annuity, the average number of whom may be stated at 4,000.
So that's a bit convoluted.
Yes, it is.
Are you able to break that down?
Well, basically what Meredith is asking Johnson, so this is Canada asking Ontario, right? Basically, Johnson is being asked to provide a statement of the net proceeds from the territories as realized annually from 1850 to the year that these net proceeds exceeded $16,000, which is $4 times 4,000, right? Because he's saying the average number is 4,000 people. So that's as clear as I can make it, right? And this is based on an assumption, and it's a false assumption, as it later turned out, that once the net revenues had reached this threshold, which would allow the payment of $4 per capita, that same condition would prevail over subsequent years. And that's literally what did not happen. But you can see the reasoning behind this.
And then can you take us through what you then write about at slide 103?
So and in fact, the calculation of arrears, if that's what, I mean, they're obviously trying to calculate arrears here. That's the reason for doing this. It would be much more complicated, obviously, because the portion of the 16,000 or a portion of the $16,000 in the amount of 4,400 would have to be first deducted, because under this theory, you'd also have to consider that the pre-augmentation obligation was already being paid. And
sorry, just for clarity, the 4,400 is what?
the 4,400 was, remember, the total amount of the RHT and RST pre-augmented yearly annuity payment.
It was the 500 plus 600.
Pounds,
Right.
yes.
You say those amounts would have to be subtracted. from any arrears.
Yeah,
or
so it's not, you know, there's a little more that would need to be done. And then you'd also have to, and since the RST and RHT were typically approached as a set, you also needed particulars from Canada about the RHT boundary. And so as a consequence of this, there were again a lengthy exchange of letters. Finally, once Canada understood what the holdup was, Meredith prepared a letter telling Ontario what Canada thought was the approximate boundary of the RHT. It was still very poorly defined and quite arbitrary, but at least it was something that Ontario could rely on in coming up with estimates of the proceeds.
And so that was what Meredith responded to in November 1877.
Yes.
Can you remind us when was that first requested?
Which one, the boundary?
The boundary, was that by Moet or was it by somebody else?
Well, the issue came up immediately at the time of Mowat in 1873 and 1874. But Canada didn't realize that this was the holdup until later. And so I think certainly by 1876, it was an issue. Meredith responded immediately once he learned in 1877 that that's what was holding things up. Ontario had sent letters explaining that this is a problem, but this is where some of this correspondence seems to have got lost in the shuffle, because Meredith was surprised that he hadn't received this. Once he did receive it, he immediately acted on it.
And then you start to describe a new Anishinaabe petition on slide 104. Can you tell us what this one is about?
So now we have a new Anishinaabe petition, and by now in 1877, the Anishinaabe were convinced that they were owed arrears, and they began wondering what the holdup was. And so they invited Boron to their council. Remember that Boron is the local MP. Has a constituency office in Sault Ste. Marie, right next to Garden River. And so he attends the council, and then again, the subject of arrears is discussed. That meeting results in Boron helping them prepare a petition. At first, the Anishinaabe were insisting that they go to see the Governor General in person. Boron kind of dissuaded them because there would be enormous cost, which inevitably would result in actually being charged against their own accounts. So he suggested the best way is to do a petition, and he would gladly assist them. And they asked him to assist him in preparing this petition. So Boron prepared a petition on their behalf. Since there were so many First Nations who joined this petition, and each one had to sign, get their own signatures, Boron decided to have it printed for circulation to the various First Nations. And so we as a consequence, there are many versions of this. They're all the same printed petition, but they have different signatures from different First Nations.
And indeed, here you say at bullet 2 that while this started with Garden River, the printed copies were signed by dozens of leaders of RHT and RST.
Yes.
And what happened to that?
So these were to be sent to the Governor General, Lord Dufferin, through the Secretary of State, which was the usual route. And so in November, Boron sent them to Scott, And he also forwarded an unsigned copy to the Minister of the Interior. And Boron gave a covering letter to Mills in which she urged the minister to apply pressure on Ontario. And again, you know, he talked about the hardships that the Anishinaabe were enduring. And then he gave his own legal theory that the province was solely liable since Confederation. And then together with Quebec before Confederation for the payment of these annuities.
And over on the next slide, can you tell us, is this what the petition set out?
Yeah, so I give, in my report, I actually give the entire petition. I scanned the entire petition on a single page, so you can read it for yourself. But this is an excerpt from it that you can see it on page 330. My report, it's kind of hard to read because it's a very fine print. But here's the excerpt on slide 105.
Slide 105, if we can go back to that.
So the petition alleged that the ceded land had yielded, quote, just short of $1 million, and that only in 1875, quote, was the annuity of your petitioners augmented or increased to $4, the maximum amount secured to them under the treaties. And end quote. They asserted that the territory that had ceded the land had, quote, produced an amount which would have enabled the government without loss to have increased their annuity from time to time, commencing soon after the date of the treaties, and that they should, as they believe, have been in the receipt of the full sum of $4 each a number of years prior to 1875, end quote. So what we have here is an understanding that the maximum amount of the annuity was $4. They wanted this full sum in arrears. They didn't specify how many years, but a number of years prior to 1875. And they believed that a large sum of money was owing to them in both arrears and interest.
Can you continue with the subject of the new Anishinaabe petition at the next slide?
So Boron, who was their advisor, really didn't have much evidence to back up these claims. The most that could be said at this time was that both Canada and Ontario believed that the income from the lands had by 1874 probably reached a level that warranted the augmentation to the maximum amount. But the only specific numbers to date were those that have been provided by Party back in 1874. And that left much open to speculation. Nobody really knew how many, if any, arrears were payable. So Boron is guessing that for a number of years, he doesn't say how many, and there's no indication that the Anishinaabe knew that either, and how would they know that? So that's about all that can be said about it.
And then you start a new subject matter within chapter 6 on slide 107, delays in Ontario's response. So at this point, they've got the boundary. What happened next?
So Canada acknowledged receiving the petition, but there's little that could be done until Ontario provided the necessary details for the arrears question. And then Canada pressed Ontario several times during 1877 and 1878. And Ontario officials responded with correspondence. And by August of 1878, the Commissioner of Crown Lands said that he and his staff were still working on the request. And then in 1879, we have a new election, and we have the new Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, who is re-elected. And Macdonald also was his own Minister of the Interior, and thus also by statute, the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. So not only was he Prime Minister, he was the Minister of the Interior and the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. So Macdonald, as soon as he was elected, he recommended to the Privy Council that more formal action be taken to ensure that Canada was pressing for an answer from Ontario. In fact, Macdonald seems to have done considerable research. He read all of the correspondence, and he asked that an order in council be approved, which happened on February the 12th, 1879. And the order just basically reiterated the necessity of obtaining a statement from Crown Lands, Ontario, showing the proceeds. And it used the same words as Meredith had originally used in his communication with Johnson, with that awkward statement about, embracing the period between the year the treaties were made and the date that the net annual proceeds exceeded the amount of $4 for each of the Indians entitled.
So this new Dominion of Canada order in council, can you tell us what happened to it?
Well, the required information, it noted that the required information had not yet been furnished, and recommended that the Governor General send a communication to the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, calling his attention to it. And so then the Assistant Secretary for the province of Ontario responded, promising that the returns would be completed at the earliest possible moment. So while that was happening, we have, as I said, a change in government, and now Dawson becomes the successor to Boron in the same Algoma constituency.
Same election that Donald
Yes.
Was reelected.
So now Dawson is the Algoma MP. And he rises in the House on March 6th of 1879 and asks that all of the correspondence between Canada and Ontario with reference to the arrears be placed on the record. Quote, according to the Hansard, Mr. Dawson said that his object in making this motion was to bring to the notice of the House and the country that there was a considerable amount due to the Indians, and that it had been withheld from them on account of a dispute between the two governments as to which should pay it. This would appear when the papers came down.
And the papers refer to what?
The papers are, he requested the correspondence, and he thought the correspondence would give the necessary illumination, I suppose is the right word, to this whole holdup.
And do you know if it did that?
Well, the record actually didn't show, I mean, I've read the record several times, and it actually didn't show that the arrears were withheld on account of this wider dispute between the governments. That's not what was going on here. They were delayed due to the absence of information required to ascertain exactly what amounts, if any, were payable.
And what was that information that was absent?
Well, a detailed fine-grained analysis, the year-by-year proceeds, costs, and expenses. So that's basically what was missing. It had nothing to do with the dispute between the two governments. That was not the holdup, because both Ontario and Canada, agreed that annuities were payable. It's just neither of them knew exactly in what year and in what amounts, if any, arrears were also payable.
But did they agree on who should pay them? That's what the quote says, that the delay is caused by a dispute between two governments. You're saying
Yes.
there's a dispute. You're saying, oh, that's not the problem. It's just that Ontario doesn't have the data.
Exactly. There is no question that there's a dispute between the two jurisdictions, but that was not the cause of the delay.
So this unresolved dispute, I just calculated it. 144 years
Not at this point.
from 1879.
Oh,
To
to
today.
today. I thought you meant from 1850.
You say the cause of the delay is the lack of data,
Yes.
but the dispute remained unresolved. So whether Ontario got the data or not, they might have started to have conversations, but they still hadn't resolved who owed the money. They hadn't resolved as between themselves.
That's right. But Dawson made it appear in the House of Commons that what the papers would show, as he put it, is that it was the dispute between the two jurisdictions that had occasioned the delay. And that's simply not the case. What had occasioned the delay was not the dispute, but rather the absence of the fine-grained analysis from Ontario.
And that's because you've told us that Blake and Mowat had agreed amongst themselves, just pay.
Yes, I mean, Ontario was not.
That just pay Canada, just pay.
Well, can't,
That wasn't a fair summary of the evidence. The just pay was in respect of the $4,
that's correct.
not in respect of the arrears or any other amounts that might be due under a proper.
That's what I was,
fair enough.
that's what I was wondering. That
Yeah,
it wasn't,
so-
that the just pay was someone's, I can't remember.
Yeah, there's a distinction that I think Mr. Von Gernert, or Dr. Von Gernert, perhaps you can clear up. The just pay, my words, was the $4. And now, as I understand you and your slides, Dawson is rising in the House to talk about, even though $4 had been paid commencing in 1875, that some amounts of $4 ought to have been paid earlier. And I understand her honor's question to be, to the extent that Mr. Dawson, MP Dawson, is asking about why that's not being paid. You can maybe illuminate that for us or tell us your opinion on that.
Yeah, so the question of the dispute between the jurisdictions about who or should not pay did not come up in this correspondence that Dawson is eliciting. I've read it. You can read it for yourself as well. That wasn't the issue. The reason for the delay was that Ontario, after repeated requests, was not delivering the information on proceeds.
is therefore your opinion on the cause of the delay that Canada would have paid the arrears had they had the information on proceeds?
The correspondence doesn't indicate any of that as an issue. As I said, the issue of who would ultimately pay didn't come up. It was merely, you recall that Mowat had, right from the beginning, said Ontario is not responsible for paying. The only thing Ontario is responsible for is providing the information. So now Canada is saying, yes, you need to provide us the information.
Mhm.
That's a separate issue from what the dispute between them about who's liable before and after Confederation and you know, for the original pre-augmented annuities or for the $4 augmentation or all of that. That was not an issue at this point. There was.
It wasn't an articulated issue in this
Yes,
correspondence,
that's right.
but we do know, we could just leave it at that. We know that it is an outstanding unresolved
Yes.
issue. And
Absolutely.
we have no idea, I think it would be fair to say, whether Canada would have paid immediately once they got the information.
That would be fair to say, yes.
Okay, we'll leave it at that.
I think then that you completed 108. Can we move to 109? What can you tell
So
us about this?
Dawson went on to say, this is still in the same House of Commons speech, that while the annuities paid to the RST Anishinaabe were initially modest, quote, the treaty contained a clause by which the government became bound to increase the annuities to $4 per head as soon as the revenues arising from the land ceded should amount to a sum sufficient to admit of this being done without loss, end quote. So the revenues had for a long time been considerable, he claimed. And then he intimated that the dispute between the two levels of government about who should pay should not prevent the Anishinaabe from receiving what was justly due to them. That was the whole import of his speech. You know, he said, don't let any disputes about who's going to pay interfere with this. But in actual fact, as I said, what was really interfering was not the dispute, but rather, I mean, irrespective of who would pay, Meredith and Langton and other officials in Canada were required information. I mean, you couldn't even get this ball rolling if you didn't know what, if any, arrears were payable. That's really what was holding things up. The who would pay was an issue, obviously, as you said, is outstanding, but it was not the cause of the delay per se. And I should add that there was no talk of any other amounts beyond $4. The considerable amount that Dawson was referring to that the Anishinaabe were justly due was, in his words, in reference to the arrears. So this was all about arrears. You know, by now they, you know, this is 1870, what is it now? We're now into 1879. So, you know, by now the Anishinaabe are receiving $4 and have been receiving $4 for several years. It's the arrears that the question is really all about. So finally then, whether because of the increased pressure or not, I don't know. But Ontario finally provided the requested information on April 15th, 1879.
here, we've moved to slide 110, is that correct?
Yes. And this was immediately forwarded to the Prime Minister. And then
And these statements, you tell us that they were prepared by Ontario's Assistant Commissioner of Crown Lands.
yes, Thomas Johnson, who had been asked by Meredith to provide them, finally released them. He was assisted by the Crown Lands Department accountant, William Ford. So you remember that awkward construction of the question that Meredith had posed to Johnson.
That convoluted language.
Yes, well, Johnson just simply ignored that language and decided to provide the raw data for everything and let others do the calculations.
And is that what you have here on the next slide at 111?
Yes, so this is a much more fine-grained analysis of expenditures and revenues.
I understand from the heading here, this is for Lake Superior and the Robinson Treaty Lake Superior in particular. Can you walk us through what is this and what does it tell us?
So Johnson and his accountant went through all of the through every year and found the records of receipts from the sale of land.
When you say every year, can you?
From 1850 to 1877. 1850, of course, was somewhat superfluous because the first annuities were actually not paid until 1851. But in any event, it covers the period 1850 to 1877. And so this is for the RST territory.
And then I see a column that says receipts for sale of land under revenue.
Yes. So when it says receipts of sale of land, at first I thought, well, let's look at all the land sales, because I compared, I did a very detailed analysis of this, a line by line analysis, and tried to match it up with all of the records that I looked through before. We talked about the 1850s and 1860s records, the annual reports and so forth. And I managed to track a lot of these, and some of them I can't explain, but others I can. In any event, when it says receipts of sale of land, that's not just lands that were sold to settlers. In fact, many of what you see, these entries in the early years, those are mining tracts.
Okay.
So remember, the regulations didn't provide for royalties, rather they provided for a license fee and the which was considered the first installment for the payment of the land. That 10 square mile chunk that mining companies were obliged to patent eventually by paying amounts. So that's what they mean by land sale, or included in the sale of land. And then there's the expenditure. So the only revenue is that first column of numbers after the dates. After that, everything is expenses.
Starting with surveys?
Yes. So you see a little trace of the line. There's a line between revenue and expenditure. It's kind of blocked out with white here, but so everything to the right of that line is actually expenditure, including surveys, roads, public works, administration of justice, expenses of land agents, and then the total disbursements.
And I think you provide a summary of what this statement tells us at the next slide. I just wonder, Your Honor, I'm in your hands. Do you wish for us to continue with that now, or would you like a break?
Let me check. Break. Right, we'll take, it's 15 minutes work. And Chelsea, how's your system working? No problem.
15 minutes?
Take 15 minutes.
All right.
I'm gonna stay here for a minute.
We'll recess for 15 minutes. When I was in, maybe see it.
Dr. Von Gurnett, I believe before the break, you were going to turn to page 112 and of your slide deck and describe to us what you take from the statement or the ledger that we looked at from slide 111. Can you do that, please?
Yes, so I did a very intense examination of sort of a fine-grained analysis of these statements, and that's outlined at pages 342 to 354 of my report. There's probably no need to get into that. I just wanted to indicate that in going through that material, I came to understand the challenges posed by the complexity of this task. It may be why Ontario took so long in compiling it. And as I concluded later in my report, it would have been so much easier if someone had kept track of this on a yearly basis since day one. But that's not what happened. What they did is try and reconstruct based on extant records going back decades. And after doing a fine-grained analysis, I then undertook to try and comprehend the larger picture that these statements produce. And that's what I tried to do in the next phase of my analysis. And to make things as simple as possible, I summarized the data in 3 tables, which are in the next slides.
And that's starting at slide 113. Can you tell us what this one is, please?
Yeah, so what I did in these tables, I didn't add or subtract anything from the data that Johnson gave. All I did is, you may recall that Meredith had originally asked for very specific data, and Johnson decided just to dump the entire record and leave to others the calculations. And so I've done that task of doing the calculations of what the actual gains and losses were for every year, which is simply a matter of math. It's not, I mean, he could have done it, but he didn't. He just gave the raw data.
When you say the raw data, what are you describing when I look at this chart?
So the raw data is in the chart that he himself gave, right? So that would be the one that we just saw at slide 111.
But this is specific to the Lake Superior Treaty.
Yes.
So then,
So
oh, I
then,
see. And then your table at 113.
yes,
That's also
that's,
Lake Superior.
yes, that's also Lake Superior. So all it is it's importing those figures that he had in his original chart and placing them in my own table and then showing the actual gains and losses. So you've got expenditures, which are given in red ink, and then you've got the losses, which are also given in red ink. And so it's a simple calculation. You subtract the expenditures from the revenues and you get the gains or losses. And this is the result. So in respect to Lake Superior, if you just look at that, the RST treaty, based on Ontario's 1879 statement, you have a net gain over the period of 1850 to 1877 in the amount of $101,301.
That's the figure you provide at the bottom of slide 113 or the
Yes.
table at slide 113.
Yes,
And that's for the entire period. Is that
that's for
correct?
the entire period, 1850. And I've broken it down by year, obviously, so you can see where that figure comes from.
And may I presume, you may be familiar with the evidence that we had early in this phase with respect to calculation of something called NCRRs. And you may be familiar with the debate over how items are classified. Did you rely on Johnson's classification of what was an expense?
Yeah, as I said in my report, that's getting into a realm that I'm not qualified to opine on. All I did here is simply use his data, what he understood, whether rightly or wrongly, to be a legitimate expense or proceed.
Thank you.
And I churned the numbers. So, yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, but it's not one that I'm qualified to give. Whether these.
So you don't vouch for the classifications of these expenses. You're just talking about the data that was provided.
Yes, the data that was provided, whether they're accurate or not. My whole intention here is to try and understand what Ontario understood at the time and what Canada understood at the time. Canada, of course, is the recipient of this data.
Mhm.
So I'm more interested in, what did people understand at the time, as opposed to what today we might reconstruct as being, a legitimate inclusion or not.
Thank you.
And can you tell us then, please, what the gains column and what the losses column tell you respecting the Lake Superior region table on page 113?
Yeah, so, I mean, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because I explained that on slide 116. But in the meantime, I did the same thing with the Lake Huron region on slide 114.
Okay, can you tell us then what the totals were there?
Yeah, and in that case, for the entire period, there was a net loss of $2,367.10. So there were no gains at all if you take that entire period.
By that you mean cumulative.
Yes,
And then what does slide 115 show us?
and then 115 shows the two combined. So if you combine the two, you have a net gain of 98,934. And, that's a figure that obviously involves offsetting the gains in one treaty territory with the losses in the other. So on page one, on slide 116, these are sort of the conclusions that can be drawn from all this, and it further illuminates what was understood at the time. So during the years 1850 to 1877, the RST lands yielded a net gain of $101,301 overall. However, in only 9 of the 27 years did revenues exceed expenditures.
And as you say, that's what the table on slide 113 shows?
Yes. So only 9 of 27 years did revenues exceed expenditures. And I list the years, they're easily seen in my table anyway.
That's the gains column. Okay, thank you.
Right.
Please continue.
And then during the years 1850 to 1877, the RHT lands incurred a net loss. And there again, in only 6 of 27 years did revenues exceed expenditures.
And again, that corresponds with the slide 114 table, is that correct?
Yes. So overall, the impression that these Crown officials had at the time is that, the land ceded to the Crown in 1850 brought in net gains and proceeds, if you look at the whole period, only if the two treaty territories were combined in the calculations, with losses in one being offset with the gains in the other.
And what can you tell us specifically about what was going on around the time that augmentation was actually made?
Well, paradoxically, during the years in which, the early years in which the first augmentations were made, paradoxically, the lands were actually yielding a loss as opposed to a gain. But as I said, the augmentations were based on guesswork. Now that they had a more fine-grained analysis, it turns out the matter is a lot more complicated. And certainly, it also reveals Meredith's naivete, if you will, and Langdon's, in the sense that it's not at all the case that once you reach an amount that would allow you to augment up to the $4, that this continues into perpetuity, because there's dips and, if you put these tables on a graph, there would be peaks and valleys, right? There's gains in some years, losses in others. So if you did it on a year-by-year basis, you're not going to reach a year after which you can throw out the red ink.
Or you're not going to reach a year after which you shouldn't track.
Yes.
And yet you've told us that, no, I'm not sure you told us that. Are you aware, based on these charts, if there was any discussion about going back in time, if you will, and not continuing the augmentation?
Well, I don't recall. I'm not sure what you're asking.
I mean that Canada, Ontario had agreed to augment, you've told us, and
Yes.
Canada was paying that. And yet we now have Johnson's
Yes.
numbers showing years in which, starting at the time that augmentation was made, that in fact there weren't gains. Was there a discussion at that point that augmentation should stop? Or did it just continue?
No, it just continued. These figures had no effect on the original decision to augment the annuities to their maximum amount.
Just a follow-up question on what Ms. Barkley just asked, which was, did years of losses have any effect on decisions, or did these figures have any effect on the original decision to augment? Was there any time at which annual statements like these, annual gains and losses were either compiled by Ontario or provided to Canada?
Not at this level of detail.
So they're not being provided with material on which, or data on which they're making any decisions.
That's correct. They're not.
And just one more thing, you've called it naivete on the part of Meredith and who was it? Langdon, that once the threshold was reached, that it would be maintained in perpetuity.
Yes. if
But
it's
can
done on
we
a-
say that that was an understanding or an acceptance? Like, was there any discussion? Is there any record of any discussion that we should track this because we want to make that decision on an annual basis? Or once it's triggered, it's triggered?
I think it was just an assumption on the part of Langton, and then Meredith tried to respond in kind with using the same assumption.
But isn't the decision made at a higher level than those two? Once there's an order in council made in 1875, they know that whoever's making that decision knows that they're not getting annual data.
That's right.
So, but do we know of any discussion about why they,
Not at this early. excuse- Not at this early juncture, no. I mean, later on, Canada and Ontario and Quebec sat down and hammered out an agreement based on looking at all of this earlier data. But at the time, I mean, one of the comments I make in my report, it would have been so much easier if somebody had kept track of this right from the beginning. But that didn't happen.
right? But that, my question was about discussions with respect to whether there was any discussion about if there was ever a need or a desire to look at threshold triggering data after 1875.
Well, after 1875, Canada requested from Ontario the particulars. And they-
Or sorry, after the arrears issue. Other than the arrears issue.
Other than the arrears issue? No, not as far as I know, because the pre-augmented annuities and the augmented annuities to the $4 cap were already in place. And the unfinished business, as I call it, was the question of whether that should have been done earlier. So, and at what point should that have been done? That's the arrears question.
You don't say the unfinished business is a system of re-looking at whether the threshold is triggered on an annual basis.
No, the unfinished business is solely the question in their minds. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's the only unfinished business, but certainly in their minds, the only unfinished business was the question of whether the augmentation should have been in place prior to 1875 as a consequence of proceeds from the lands having reached the threshold.
Okay, thank you. If you may have something that goes.
I might. So when they make the decision in 1875, now notwithstanding after the fact, belatedly, that in fact in 1875, at least on Johnson's numbers from Ontario, it didn't support an augmentation. At that point, do you know if they go back to the language of the treaty without incurring loss and consider that at all? Or do they just continue? I think you said earlier, the benefit of the doubt, they just continue to pay that.
Yeah, they just continued paying it. They didn't, at no point, as far as I know, did they, at least during this period, reconsider whether any of the payments that were made for the augmentations after 1875 were questionable and should be, that was not, they didn't touch that. I mean, that's.
Okay, so you were talking about arrears and I didn't mean to distract you. Should we go back to that then? I think you're on slide 117.
Yeah, so Johnson, on behalf of Ontario, provided a much more detailed and fulsome statement than Canada had requested. As I said earlier, Johnson just felt that, he's not going to do the calculations or the reasons for the calculations. He's just going to give them the raw numbers for all the years. And that gives us a better sense of the overall condition at the time. So the 1879 statements illustrate that, this was not simply a case of proceeds steadily increasing until they reached a year of black ink. And the other thing I wanted to emphasize here is, and I first raised this in our discussion of Russell's 1857 opinion, that depending on how you understand the language of the treaty or how you understand what scenario there is for meeting the treaty obligation, different results are going to ensue, right? So what is sufficient under one scenario to augment the annuities may be quite different from a different equally viable scenario, right? It depends on whether you use it on a year-to-year, you do it on a year-to-year basis, or whether you think of it, in more in the larger picture, or whether you combine the two treaties, or whether you you offset losses in one year with gains in another. There's so many different variables. So it's again, at first blush, this all seems simple, but you need to adopt certain assumptions before you can even decide on what constitutes the threshold to augment the annuities. And that, I should add, that complexity continued to be an issue all the way to the end of the 19th century, when an arbitrator had to decide some of these issues. This was still an outstanding thing decades later.
And I believe you've now taken us through the different scenarios that you outline on slide 118. Perhaps we can, unless you have anything further to add, perhaps we can turn to slide 119, where you go back to Russell's opinion of 1857.
Yes, so on slide 119, we have the larger picture again. So if we compare this to Russell's 1857 opinion, at that time, a capital fund totaling over 70,000 would have been required just to finance the pre-augmented annuities. And a capital fund well over 100,000 was needed to finance only the difference between the pre-augmented annuity and the $4 cap, if you assume a time of treaty population. And so the figures from 1850 to 1857, which is the only thing Russell would have had, are given at table 13 on slide 119. And you see that they're not even close to these requirements. So, I mean, in the case of the RHT, the government had actually incurred a net loss during that period. The RST territory at least had a good start. It still wasn't quite enough, but it had a good start on it. So you see how different assumptions about how to calculate the augmentation, or how to calculate the time when the augmentation clause was met, differ depending on how you
You are talking to a room that has had 10 days of people trying to calculate gains and losses. So we have some appreciation.
Good. Well, it was no different back then, I think. It wasn't an easy thing. And Your Honor, I don't have the benefit of any of the experience of the other witnesses who have done this. I did this entirely independently of anyone else. So I'm glad that
Well,
is.
so did the historic actors.
And to the extent that you mentioned here that Russell's 1857 opinion would have required a capital fund totaling over $70,000 to finance the pre-augmented annuities. And of course, you've told us that the pre-augmented annuities were in fact capitalized,
Yes,
and that was $88,000. Is that
Yes.
correct? I have that right?
yes.
And on slide 120, what can you tell us about what you've put here? You've got another chart.
Yeah, so this is just a reminder of Sprague's solution. And so you can do the same thing. You can so if you look at his solution, and then you go to page 121, sorry, it's slide 121.
Yes.
The gains necessary to finance Sprague's proposal were not available from the RSD lands until the 1860s, and from the RHT lands until the 1870s.
And what can we take from your decision to draw us all to the differences between Russell and Sprague's models? Is there something you want? Is there a reason?
Well,
you wanna tell us?
the reason I call attention to these is that you know, we keep wondering, you know, why did, for example, Russell conclude that there weren't enough proceeds for the augmentation? Well, here's an answer, right? And in the same way, we can look at Sprague and his
But you-
solution.
Sorry, sir, but you said that they were guessing that they didn't have this data.
That's right. No, Russell, obviously as Commissioner of Crown Lands back then, he had data.
Not that we found.
Well-
That he put down and organized.
He didn't provide the actual figures, but we have the figures from his own Crown Lands reports. Right? I mean, it's not as if he's not in the dark the way Canada was later, right? He is on the ground. He's the Assistant Crown Lands Commissioner in 1857.
And
And
that-
remember,
that-
he
and at that point, 1857, we're talking about the United Province.
That's right. And so, and he is, remember, he's the one that actually wrote portions of Couchon's report, which listed, you know, the various income categories of from lands in the admittedly ill-defined territories. So Russell had a much better sense. And if this is the type of information that he had at his disposal, then it makes sense that he included it the way he did. The problem that we have today, of course, is trying to reconstruct what their rationale was for the conclusions they reached. And since there are so many different ways in which you can construe meeting the obligation, it's not as if we have one limited choice. We have several different choices and assumptions that were potentially held at the time. As I say, it's a messy affair. Like much of history, it's messy, and in this case, it's surprisingly complex.
I think you were taking us through 121.
Yeah, so again, so paradoxically, as I said earlier, Canada first began augmenting the Robinson Treaty annuities during the years when, according to Johnson's numbers, both treaty territories were realizing net losses. So if you had envisioned a scenario whereby you do it year by year, then they wouldn't have been paid at all their augmented annuities at any level of augmentation in 1875. But they got their $4 because Mowat and Blake ultimately gave the Anishinaabe the benefit of the doubt.
And then if we can turn over to slide 122, you're still talking here about the larger picture drawn from the 1879 statements. And you reintroduce Pardee.
Yes.
What can you tell us about Pardee's figures?
Well, Pardee's figures had not included costs. And so when you look at Johnson figures, the Johnson figures as he gave them, you see that that is in fact the case. Because it was never, Pardee had never indicated whether it included costs. So that's an open question. And Mowat doesn't appear to have cared one way or the other. There's no record that he questioned, whether these were net or whether they, took into consideration the portion of the augmentation clause that referred to loss. But now we realize that in fact Pardee had not included costs. Still, if you do the math, this Pardee's estimate is still an amount, or I should say, if you use Johnson's figures instead of Pardee's, you reach a calculation that this amount is still more than what is needed to set up a capital fund for the RST of the type that Sprague had contemplated.
Can you say this amount that proceeds?
Yes, the 117,234, which is the net RST revenues for the entire period of 1850 to 1874. Keeping in mind that Sprague proposed his scenario in 1873. Right, so it's Sprague had the actual figure in front of him, which would be 117,000. Then that would have enabled the capital fund that Sprague had contemplated at the time.
So Johnson's figures then go to Canada, I believe you told us.
Yes.
And what did Canada do with them? What happened next?
So, well, meanwhile, I mean, I guess the House of Commons was still voting each year to approve the grant for the CRF. And by that time, 1879, it was 14,000.
We're on slide 123, the first bullet point here.
I'm sorry?
I believe you're reading from slide 123.
Yes, so by 1879, the amount that had been allocated for the augmented annuities was 14,000.
Up from 11,000.
Yes. As far as I could tell, there were no negotiations or progress since 1875, when Ontario and Canada had agreed to refer the case to the courts. Prime Minister Macdonald now believed that Ontario was responsible, even though 4 years earlier when he was in opposition, he had intimated that Canada was responsible. Macdonald now claimed that correspondence had been going on vigorously between Ontario and Canada, and that Ontario didn't seem to be in much of a hurry. But when he made this comment, he made no mention of the statements which had actually literally landed on his desk just a week or 2 weeks earlier.
Those are the Johnson statements you've taken us through.
Yes, those have been, I mean, I have, there's good evidence that the Prime Minister had received those statements himself.
And we're talking about 1879.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. And
So,
then,
so then we have the aftermath to all of this, and we get back into this business of the Section 142 of the B&A Act, which involved the settlement of accounts between Canada, Ontario, and Quebec. And you may recall that this was to be dealt with through arbitration, and I've examined all of this material myself, but I also understand that another expert wrote a report on this, and I've not seen that report, so I have no idea what, if any, overlap there is with that. But the insights that I gleaned from my own perusal of this material is found in my report. There was already, as I said, an earlier arbitration back in 1870, an award. And now there was also another award, which is sometimes known as award number 3, dated February of 1895. And this award specifically addressed the issue of which government was responsible for the payment of these augmented annuities. Among other things, the award confirmed what was widely understood already in respect to these numbers, namely that the territory produced that in the event that the territory produced an amount that enabled the government without incurring loss to pay increased annuities, that the Anishinaabe were entitled to this increase, not exceeding $4 for each individual. That was the first paragraph of the award. And then another paragraph, the second paragraph, confirmed what had also already been in place since 1875, and that the maximum amount of the annuities payable under the RST and RHT was a sum equal to $4 multiplied, not by the population figures given in the treaties, as Bragg had suggested, but rather by the number of entitled individuals who were living at the time when the annuities were payable, i.e. the layered scenario or solution, which had been accepted.
and understanding then that others will go into detail, perhaps you can take us through slides 125 in summary fashion with the rest of what you set out here about that particular award, number 3.
Yeah, so the arbitrators also confirmed that the responsibility to pay these increased annuities for any years prior to Confederation was a debt or liability which devolved upon Canada under Section 111 of the B&A Act. Now, the provinces were probably disappointed that the earlier capitalization of the annuities did not absolve them from responsibility for the pre-Confederation increased annuities that formed the so-called excess debt. You remember there was a figure of like 65 million or something, that the excess above that would be part of the pre-Confederation debt of the ancestors of these two provinces of Ontario and Quebec. And then a particular concern to Ontario was paragraph 6, which set out that the Robinson Treaty lands that Ontario inherited basically upon Confederation were subject to a trust, and that Ontario was liable for the payment of the annuity augmentations. And this was based in part on a view that the augmentation clause contained some kind of an implied obligation to pay the increased annuities out of the proceeds. So following the publication of that award, boron comes into the
Can I
picture.
just ask one question?
Sure.
This phrase, increased annuities, is that distinct from the annuities, the $4 annuity?
That might be a legal question.
Or, well, is it your word? Is it the word from the award?
Perhaps we can turn up the award.
Okay,
That particular paragraph, paragraph 6, is at page 373 in its entirety of Dr. Von Grenet's report.
and where am I looking?
Paragraph
Paragraph
6.
6, halfway through, about midway through page 373.
So those words are used there.
Yes.
And then you say, Dr. Von Gernet, that that was a particular concern to Ontario. What happened after award number 3 was released? Can you tell us that?
Well, among other things, Boron, who is now no longer the MP, but was appointed by Mowat to become Ontario's stipendiary magistrate for the Judicial District of Northern Nipissing, which again is in a massive territory going all the way up into the north to the limits of jurisdiction of Ontario at the time. And he prepared detailed comments, which he sent in May of 1895 to Emilius Irving, who was Ontario's counsel. And he seemed unconcerned that the arbitrators had found Ontario solely liable. But he did have grave concerns about who was or who would be entitled to the annuities. His main concern was not that Ontario would be having to pay, but rather who's going to determine who's actually entitled. He feared that the proposed definition that the arbitrators had made was too liberal and quote, and calculated, quote, to saddle upon the province forever an unlimited number of annuitants, end quote.
And what was his concern with that? What was he thinking of?
Well, so if Ontario is going to take on the cost, the problem is that it's an open-ended number of annuitants. I mean, it could increase infinitely depending on the definitions of entitlement. And so he had a concern, for example, about the so-called half-breeds, people who were of mixed blood. And he argued that the arrears should only be paid to those who were properly entitled, although he didn't define what that was, or to bona fide Indians, as he called them. Now, that, of course, is not an issue, as I said very early on in my testimony, not exclusive to the Robinson Treaties, a long and complex history, which I need not get into. But that was his main concern. And of course, that's all premised on the notion that the annuities are always going to be $4 at their maximum. So that's not going to change. But what is going to change is the number of $4 annuitants over time, depending on definitions of entitlement.
And you say here that there was an emergence of statutory definitions of Indian. Can you tell us what you're referring to there?
Yeah, I mean, by this time, of course, you had the 1869, there was an 1869 act which defined who was and who was not an Indian, and that became part of the Consolidated Indian Act of 1876. That's what.
This is Canada's or Ontario's?
No,
Act?
Canada's Indian Act. And that defined, who is and who is not an Indian. That became very contentious, even though the necessity for a definition of Indian was stimulated by requests from First Nations who wanted a statutory definition because they wanted clarity in this matter. And so, as I said, it gets pretty complicated, and I alluded to this in my earlier testimony about Bill C-31 and how that tried to correct the discriminatory provisions and so forth. So all of this is now already in play because the Indian Act has long been passed. It's already, we're into the 1890s, and so this has been going on for some time. And so when Boron gets into this, he is also, concerned about how these definitions are going to be applied in the particular case of the Robinson treaties. And Robinson himself had already been aware that this was a potential issue, because back at the time of treaty, you may recall that this issue of so-called half-breeds arose, and Robinson said, you know what, once we set the annuity, it doesn't really matter. We let the chiefs decide on who to include and who to exclude. That was his sort of solution to the problem. It wouldn't, for Robinson, it would not occasion a rise in costs because the annuity was expressed as a fixed sum. And so, this was not an issue, but now it became an issue because once you decide that you give the $4 annuity to every entitled individual, irrespective of whether it's way above the time of treaty population, you run into what basically is an open-ended cost that is unpredictable in the future. And that makes it very different from the pre-1850 treaties, where the annuity was always predictable and the cost was always the same, irrespective of entitlement issues.
Honor, I'm cognizant of the time. Should we stop at that point today and pick up tomorrow?
Yes, we should. So it's past 4:30. We'll call it a day, go off the record. Thank you very much, sir. We'll